So we turn to books 13 to 20 of Homer's Odyssey, which represents a point of transition in the work back to Ithaca. And in fact, the remaining books that we'll see will in fact all take place within the home of Odysseus, Ithaca, and his house. So there's a number of new characters that enter the scene. We see a dog, Argos, which will in fact be one of the more memorable scenes of the work. We see a number of bad suitors, some not so bad suitors, who receive in fact the same fate as the bad suitors. We see a beggar who fights Odysseus, some disloyal maids and servants, and a goat herder. We see some loyal servants as well, and we see a seer and prophet, Theoclymenus. So some of the main events of these books. We have that Odysseus returns finally after 20 years to Ithaca. He stays with his loyal servant. He finally gets to reunite with his son, a son who he hadn't seen since basically his birth, and a son who had never met his father until now. He takes on the disguise, in fact, Athena helps him to do this, of a beggar, and he's able to enter the house, his own house, and roam about unidentified, and therefore to survey the situation, where he has a number of encounters and finally gets to meet his wife, who is unable to identify him, though the old maid does, who raised him as a child. And there's some more omens and some further abuse, which will then lead to the final culminating works, which we'll talk about after this, of 21 to 20 books, 21 to 24, which will be the final culminating scenes. So some of the themes here is that transition back to Ithaca, assuming the beggar's role, some contrasts. We see Telemachus finally grows up, some outrages against Odysseus, some more omens and prophecies, and this issue of who recognizes Odysseus and why. So here's just a modern-day picture of Ithaca. We see this beautiful coastline here, and this sort of typical scene of a Greek island town. They're basically great places to visit. If you ever get the opportunity, you should go to Greece. You should actually go to Greece now. It's quite cheap, just as a little word of advice. So some literary transitions. There is this tale of return now. And it transitions to a tale of judgment and revenge. So we see Odysseus was trying to get back, and now that changes. Now he has to face 108 suitors, and of course he arrives basically on his own, and so he must find at least someone to help him, but for the most part he's going to face it on his own with a few individuals who help, such as his son and one or two of his servants. There's a number of omens, there's this oppositions, this xenia, lack of xenia among the suitors, which will help to hone in this kind of issue of revenge and that they deserve it. There's these earlier prophecies that begin to be fulfilled within the work, earlier prophecies within the book from the very beginning, first page, for example, of the work, into the underworld as well. We see here, note, the dead foresee the future. This will be important when we talk about Dante later, because we're going to see that the dead will have this foresight, and it's seen even here within the ancient text, this kind of notion, this idea. So there's this realm of fantasy as well, transitions to a realm of reality. This is an interesting transition because books 1 to 8 we saw, maybe the first book talks of the gods, but then it transitions more into the realistic realm, where we see the discussion of Odysseus' son, Telemachus, and some of the early encounters of Odysseus, but then it transitions into this fantastic scene of cyclops and monsters, etc., finally returning to this kind of realm of reality in the second part of the work, these scenes of very human conflicts where the gods, although they play a part, they play a very minor role. Some further transitions. We see that it reintroduces the persons and scenes of the first books. So we get to meet these people again, and it kind of fulfills their roles and characters. We have, of course, the plight of Telemachus, the struggles and Penelope against the suitors, and of course the outrages of the suitors themselves. We see that there's a connection that's formed once again between Odysseus and Athena. So these two are connected basically also on account of the fact that Athena is known within the Greek mythology as this goddess of wisdom, of cunning, and Odysseus is indeed this warrior of metis, of cunning. And so this connection is important to be established. It was kind of lost or muted within the earlier books leading up to this, and now it's reaffirmed in these final books, because Athena will indeed aid Odysseus throughout and until the end, in sort of minor roles, but in important minor roles. So we have a new task for Odysseus now. So he no longer needs to confirm his identity, his kleos, right, his good name. He has to kind of, let's say, bring his good name into some sort of final account, rendering of account with the suitors who have basically squandered his goods and lived in his house. But he doesn't need to really find that identity and to confirm that identity. Rather, he needs to conceal it, because, well, if the suitors got wind of the fact that Odysseus did indeed return, they would know immediately that this man would seek revenge, and they would therefore seek, while he was still weak, returning home without any help, to immediately murder him. So we have this beggar's role that he assumes. And now when he lands upon the beach and the Phaeacians drop him off, he encounters Athena, who kind of helps him to get into this role. And this role really serves an excellent literary purpose. And it also helps this notion of this transition, and it helps to bring to the fore the various problems and to help bring those problems to the fore that Odysseus faces now. And here we see two problems at the outset once he returns home. First, how to avoid getting killed. This is important because he faces 108 suitors who are in his house, and so he has that problem, how to avoid getting killed. I should probably add here, while, let's say, reclaiming his wife and his home. The second is how to kill the suitors, and how to kill all of them. All right. So now this is an important point in terms of his good name. The suitors, all of them, all who have betrayed his good name, must face the same, let's say, revenge against them. And the reason is that they have betrayed a kind of universal justice between, let's say, the guest and the host, between the gods' goodwill and the human beings' misuse of it, for example. So in a way, they have been judged, and the gods have judged them, and so they must all face this fate of death. So, and then we have, which will be the end scene, really the finale, after the finale, the end scene, is how to avoid revenge. Well, because all of these suitors are mostly young men or early middle-aged men from wealthier houses within the region of the island of Ithaca. And so now he's going to murder, basically, you think of them as 108 sons of other men and women. And so they're going to be, of course, extremely angered by this, and they'll want to take revenge on Odysseus for doing this. And so he's going to have to figure out how to avoid revenge. We'll talk about this because Homer doesn't really sort of tie this up very well, and we'll see why. So there's this purpose of transformation into the beggar. It solves these problems. It's a literary device, for one thing, as I noted, because it adds mystery to the whole encounters that he has with the suitors who don't recognize him, with his wife who doesn't recognize him as either, with others who do recognize him, and with some, like his son, who he reveals himself to, but who must keep quiet, even as his father is being, for example, abused by the suitors before his very eyes. So then it serves a moral purpose. He's a beggar now, and he looks like a beggar. And as a beggar, well, who comes to a wealthy house, one has a certain duty to offer to that beggar some kind of hospitality. The suitors do not do this. They do, in fact, the opposite. And so this will serve to emphasize the contrast here in terms of these suitors who lack kleos and they're bad characters. So as a beggar, Odysseus remains concealed. So he can enter the palace unharmed, right? So no one recognizes him, so he's able to enter his own home without being seen. He will be tested. So the suitors will indeed abuse him in various ways. Another point of this is that he can reveal himself when he wants, and he does so to Telemachus at Eumaeus' house. And he can also test and determine those who are loyal, as well, I should add, disloyal to him. And he sees this with a number of servants who are loyal, and he recognizes a number of servants who are not loyal, and he's also able to determine this in relation to his wife, okay, which is very important as well, to see has she been loyal to him all these years. I should put in parenthesis, even though he hasn't been very loyal, if we recall all of his trysts with the different goddesses such as Calypso and Circe, right? So it's a little bit of an inequality going on between how a man ought to relate to women when he's away and how a wife ought to relate to the man who is her husband. A bit different. So some difficulties. He must determine who is loyal to him. As I said, he must determine the opportune time for revenge, when to take revenge, okay? Because he can't just do it at any time. It has to be done right, since he's facing at least he's outnumbered at least 1 to 10, and he must at least let's say 1 to 30, because he's only going to have about 3 others to help him or so he's going to be vastly outnumbered, and he must endure the humiliation of the suitors until the time in which he can actually take that revenge, and Athena does indeed warn him of this. So the moral contrast being further emphasized. So first of all, this second part of the Odyssey, we see this transition from an epic, right? This epic, the struggles on the sea, which Odysseus faces with various creatures and societies, such as the Lastrygonians. And this is diminished, and it becomes a kind of moral drama. It's not quite a tragedy because it ends optimistically, but we can see it more in terms of, if you're familiar with Shakespeare's Hamlet, that's more of a moral drama. It is indeed a tragedy. It ends tragically, but it's about a young man, Hamlet, who wants to take revenge for the indignities done upon his house. And so it is kind of in the Shakespearean tragic spirit in that sense. The difference being, it's a very important difference, that it does not end tragically. It ends, in fact, happily, at least for Odysseus. So this theme of struggle then changes. So he's not trying to get home. He's trying to overcome struggles at home, right? It's also the theme of revenge, as opposed to this, the struggle itself is emphasized. The suitors must die. He must restore his good name. Okay, so this is a very important transition here, which can help you to understand the second half of the book and to distinguish it from that first half. Some further contrasts we see between Eumaeus and Melanthius. So we see in testing the different servants, they will be tested based upon not only how they have treated the house itself, how they have related to the suitors while he is gone, how they've treated his family, but also how they treat him just as this unknown beggar who returns. And we see that Eumaeus, the swineherd, has all this time cared for his master's affairs. When he meets the beggar, he offers him food, a place to sleep, even on the straw, and a winter coat because he was so cold. Melanthius, a goat herder, serves the suitors. He mocks Odysseus when he sees him, thinking he's a beggar, and he even tries to trip him at one point. And we'll see that Melanthius, and we can talk about this a bit later, really gets an extremely gruesome death, the worst death I think, among all of the individuals within the book. And we have now Odysseus versus the beggar itself. So in other words, Odysseus himself versus himself as a beggar, and this is a very sharp contrast. It shows the cunning of Odysseus in assuming this guise of the beggar and being able to restrain himself. He is the king of Ithaca. He is the hero of Troy. He is the cunning man of these various tales. And what does he do? He takes on the role of a beggar. He's a once noble man tossed into these slavish conditions. He tells a tale of this to others because he has to assume a role of a different man, for example, who has undergone sufferings and now appears on Ithaca, okay, being kind of noble, but no longer, now within this new state. And so this is a very strong transition. It shows Odysseus' ability to take on roles. And if you recall from an earlier lesson, Odysseus has already taken on the role of a beggar. And we saw this, for example, in the Greek assault on Troy, especially when it came to the Trojan horse, that final assault where they finally deceived the Trojans into letting them into the city. Odysseus had already entered into the city that day before, and as a beggar. And so now here he is at home assuming a similar role. So he's very good at disguises. He's a very cunning, crafty man. So the boy you knew is gone, and this will be about Telemachus here. It's this kind of mask. The boy you knew is gone. Notice this is actual words spoken by Telemachus to his mother, and they'll actually be repeated various ways throughout the remaining books. What has happened is Telemachus has gained a good name. He has basically become, you can say, a man, has come of age, and so he is now ready. And as you read the text, once Odysseus and his son reunite, that he is ready to help his father, and he is willing, and most importantly, he is able to now. And so this is why Athena didn't tell him the truth at the beginning, and maybe you thought about this early on in the book. Athena knew where Odysseus was. She knew he was on Ogygia when she tells Telemachus to find news. And in fact, Odysseus, in encountering Athena on the shores of Ithaca, and she reveals that his son's traveling at the moment, looking for him, he says, "Why didn't you tell him that I was alive and returning home?" And she responds and she says, "Hey, I escorted your son so he could make his name by sailing there." In other words, so he could be of help for you in getting revenge on the suitors. And indeed, Telemachus will be of vital help to his father. So we see that Telemachus has this kleos, this good name, affirmed. He no longer quakes in fear before the suitors. You'll have to notice this in reading the encounters that he has with the suitors. You don't see this quaking, crying young man anymore. Why? Because he's a man, and his father is there too. See, it's very important too. He has this confidence now that he has gained on his own, but also the strength of his father and the strength of his father's house is returning to him. And so he obtains this ability and becomes more Odyssean as his father. And he is now prepared, as I said, to help his father. And this is important. It shows his kleos and his metis as well, his cunning as his father. He has to keep silent. He can't tell his mother, "Mother, father has returned." He cannot tell her. And so he can't even tell his grandfather, who is in fact living in another house, deeply in sorrow. And in fact, Odysseus would like to tell his father that he's returned, but he can't, and neither can his grandson. And he also has to endure the suitors' abuse. So the suitors will abuse his father, who will be disguised as a beggar when he enters the house, and they will abuse him in very nasty ways. And you can only imagine this, that someone that you loved was in the house of someone else, of individuals, or rather was in your own house, and there were individuals there who refused to leave and who were extremely disrespectful and nasty, and they abused this person. Of course, you would immediately want to do something to defend that person who they are abusing. Well, in this case, Telemachus, who has just now been reunited with his beloved father, has to see his father abused before his eyes and must keep silent and do nothing. And that shows his ability, that his metis. So, and then finally, the largest task that he has to face as a man, and really the role of Telemachus has been preparing for the event in which he is able to help his father slay these suitors. So, the moral contrast between the suitors and Odysseus is very important, and I think that the beggar's role helps to do this, because it shows that not only are the suitors, in this case, the suitors are extremely, let's say, violent even towards the individuals in Odysseus's house, because they want to steal the wealth of Odysseus, and not even to marry Penelope, but just to obtain the wealth and really to obtain the kingship. It's not only that, they also mistreat and abuse individuals who enter the house. They show that they lack complete inhospitability. They show that they are individuals who are to be hated even by the gods, and that their judgment, the final judgment in which they are to be executed by Odysseus, is really a judgment that is long overdue. Okay, so let's look at some of the ways in which he's mistreated when he enters Ithaca and his house. First of all, Melanthius, the disloyal servant, tries to trip him and also abuses him with words. We see that Antinous, Eurymachus, and Ctesippus, these are three different suitors, in fact, throw different objects at him, throw stools. I mean, these are hard, heavy wooden stools, and these men, okay, would have been individuals used to the games, throwing something like a shot put and throwing spears. So these are extremely strong men who can throw something heavy, extremely large, and they can throw it at high speeds. And one of them hits him in the back with this stool. Interestingly, Odysseus barely flinches. And that kind of, they see this, that this sort of gruesome-looking beggar is extremely strong. Okay, and Odysseus is indeed very strong. Ctesippus hits him with an ox hoof. A maid, Melanthius, taunts and scorns him. Indeed, the maids of the house who have been disloyal will receive a rather unfortunate end, along with the suitors themselves. And finally, the suitors force him to fight another beggar, Iris, and in this fight, they should have indeed been awakened to the fact that this beggar was no ordinary man, because the Iris, who's this rather big guy, Odysseus hits him once, and you hear the cracking of bones when he hits him. So Odysseus is extremely powerful, and as a beggar, he's mistreated. And in these mistreatments, the suitors ought to have gotten wind of the fact that this is an odd man. And indeed, in some ways they were. They're kind of very anxious over the presence of this beggar, which actually Telemachus and his mother has allowed into the house. All along, Telemachus watches in silence. So some omens and prophecies begin to appear throughout the work, throughout these final books, which begin to foretell the doom approaching the suitors, and the suitors themselves start to become aware of this sort of subconsciously. We see this, for example, in Theoclymenos, the prophet, who mentions of the certainty of Odysseus' return, and in certain instances speaks of this. We see Telemachus sneezes after Penelope curses Antinous. This might be seen as a minor point, but of course, when we say, when somebody sneezes, we often say, bless you, and this kind of brings up the idea that, well, this sort of the origin, sneezing somehow, there's this presence of the supernatural. There's the beggar's warning, Odysseus himself, where he says, our lives, they turn as the days turn. In other words, You taunt me now, suitors, but you could actually receive a similar or even worse fate. And also he says, but not even so could he escape his fate. This is actually stated by Homer. Amphinomus actually at some point sort of asked the suitors to kind of, hey guys, chill out. You're being a bit abusive here of this man who is obviously down, on his luck, and you're throwing stools at him. Maybe you should just leave him alone. But unfortunately, Homer notes that even this man, he had spent far too long in the house, and so he must receive the same fate. And so these warnings arise frequently, more and more frequently as the book proceeds on toward the end. So we see various further omens. An eagle clutching a dove flies past, as Philoetius asserts his will to fight the suitors, Philoetius being now another of the good servants, the loyal servants. We see also Zeus, the god, the great god, king of the gods, thunders. And just so you know, as an important point, we have Zeus here. The Greek term is Deus, okay, and Deus in the Latin refers, of course, to the notion of God. So anyhow, Zeus thunders after Odysseus prays to him for vengeance, hearing Penelope weep. Okay, so Odysseus prays so he hears Penelope weeping at some point, and he prays to Zeus, please grant me vengeance, and thunder crackles outside, right? So then there's this Dionysian Frenzy. This is a very interesting scene. So the suitors are at feasting, and at some point they start to laugh at Telemachus, who opposes them in a kind of mature way, actually surprising them, but then they start to laugh, and this laughter turns into this kind of insane laughter. You can imagine this laughter building up till it becomes hysterical and insane, and then finally it transforms into weeping. And it's this weeping is this kind of this subconsciousness of the suitors. Now, subconsciousness here, you have to see it in a very kind of pre-modern, pre-Freudian sense. Our subconsciousness is connected to our souls, right? And the soul is connected to, okay, what is spiritual in the human being, and the spiritual in the human being transcends just the everyday norms of the past, the present, and future. And so in weeping, the subconsciousness of the suitors has somehow come into contact with the terrible end which they will face in the future, and here they experience it in the present. We have also Theoclymenos, as I said. He foresees their end, and through a prophecy, poor men, he says, when he sees this, what terror is this that overwhelms you? And he says, oh, I can see it now. The disaster is closing on you all. And they mock him for this. A smart man at that point would have gotten up from his dinner chair and left the house and not returned. So we have certain individuals who recognize Odysseus. In one of the more touching scenes is his old dog, so 20 plus years old. Remember, he's gone for 20 years. And Argos was one of the nice prize hunting dogs. And 20 years later, this poor, extremely old dog is left to sleep on a pile of manure. So nobody likes him. He stinks. They just tell him to shoo off, this old dog that nobody cares about. When he sees Odysseus, he perks up, he wags his tail. And Odysseus, who sees him, forces himself not to respond. In other words, he sees his dog, and his dog rising up to him to greet his master after 20 years. And of course, Odysseus just wants to grab that dog in his arms and to greet him back. And the dog, after seeing his master, is satisfied and dies thereafter. So the dog waited 20 years to see his master. We see another recognition occurs in Philoetius, the cowherd. He says, for example, upon immediately seeing the beggar, he says, I broke into a sweat, my friend, when I first saw you. See, my eyes still brim with tears, remembering him, Odysseus. He must wear such rags. So in other words, he sees the beggar and he immediately thinks about Odysseus. evidently, even though he doesn't recognize him in terms of saying, "You are Odysseus," somehow he recognizes Odysseus anyhow. We see Euryclea, who identifies Odysseus directly. She's the old man who used to take care of him. And at some point, the dirty beggar is in the house, and they offer to bathe him. And of course, during that time, they would be bathed by the maids. And so she comes out, and so he undresses, and he's in the bath. She washes him and sees an old scar which resulted from a boar attack in Parnassus when he was a boy. So this is a really kind of an interesting point, actually. I'm not sure how many of you have children or how many of you have very young siblings, for example, but you can only imagine that if you were a child, let's say maybe about 8 to 10 or even 12 years old, that your parents sent you to Parnassus, to your uncle's house, for example, or your aunt's house, and there you went out hunting. They took you hunting, and they said, "Go out and get the boar, and with your spear." Well, this is what they did, and unfortunately, at that point, Odysseus was attacked by the boar, and it basically bored him with his tusk, and unfortunately, it just was a sort of flesh wound. It didn't hit the bone. So anyhow, she identifies him, and as she identifies him, she turns to get Penelope to say, "Hey, it's this Odysseus." And Odysseus grabs her by the throat, and you can imagine holds her against the wall, and he says, "Nurse, do you want to kill me?" In other words, do not reveal who I am. And so she stays silent, and she helps him with a few others, including his son, to obtain revenge. And in fact, she's extremely happy in the end when this occurs, even though he shows up to her completely soaked through in blood. So let's then get to the finale, which is, for the most part, the scenes where Odysseus finally reveals himself to the suitors, strings the bow, a very important symbol in the work and memorable scene, and finally he, with his son and a few of his loyal servants, slay all of the suitors in this great and terrible bloodbath, after which they also kill some of the disloyal servants, including Melanthius. So some of the themes here is the plan, which is concocted in order to take revenge, the final death of the suitors, the final encounter, meeting, and revealing of himself to Penelope, and then the final scenes of the work. So the plan itself, and here's just a kind of a little image of some of the armor that we could imagine the ancient Greeks would actually wear to battle. We see here an ancient Greek aspis shield, muscle cuirass here, a Corinthian helmet, a dory spear, and a copsis sword, which is there. All right. So some of these weapons would have been stowed away in Odysseus's armory, and this will be part of the plan, as we'll see. So step one is the contest. So Penelope actually concocts this plan unaware of the fact that Odysseus is there. Of course, Homer's writing the work, and it serves as a very good literary device for helping to bring the end scenes into this wonderful finale. And so she says to Odysseus, when he's speaking to her at some point, that I mean to announce a contest with these famous axes, that he has, the ones he would often, meaning Odysseus, line up here inside the hall, 12 in a straight unbroken row, like blocks to shore a keel, then stand well back and whip an arrow through the lot. And so these are just different possible pictures of what this would have been like. You see here, so they would take axe handles, bury it into the ground, and they would line them up as neatly as possible, and then the archer would take a bow and try to shoot it as evenly as possible so the bow went straight through all of the axe handles. So obviously this is a feat which is not easy to in fact accomplish. Only really an accomplished bowman could do this. And Odysseus, among many of his talents, was an accomplished archer. So the second step was to stow the weapons. And here we see this step. Odysseus says it to his son. I'll give you a nod, he says. And this is during the process in which he's finally encountering these suitors and revealing himself. And when you catch that signal, round up all the deadly weapons kept in the hall, stow them away upstairs in a storeroom's deep recess. So he has all the weapons now, right? And what he wants to do is hide the weapons, because the first thing that the suitors are going to do once they realize Odysseus is present will be to head for the weapons, right? Because at most they will have a sword on them. They will not have armor. They will not have spears, and a spear is the best weapon really for a battle, in fact, because a spear you can take a distance, whereas the weapon you have to fight close up, which would be then difficult against especially someone who has a spear who can throw that spear at you, right? So next is, step 3 is to bar the doors. And so the cowherd, so this will happen toward the end game, the end scenes, will quietly bound it out of the house to lock the gates of the high stockaded court. This is a rather, notice this is a rather nasty scene here. Well, what happens is that, so they're going to be in the house, all the suitors, so they'll have two reactions when Odysseus is seen. First, to get weapons to defend themselves, and second, to run. Obviously, that would be probably the best course of action at the time, because, well, when being surprised like this, the best option is to run in order to sort of regain one's footing and to determine what best to do from a point of advantage rather than disadvantage. So they keep the suitors from doing this by locking the doors in order to keep them in. 4 is the bow. And this, we see here some of the Homer's statements. It is his back-sprung bow with its quiver, bristling arrows, shafts of pain, gifts from the old days, from a friend he'd met in Lacedaemon, Iphitus, Eritus' gallant son. So the bow is a gift, and it's actually a very special bow, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the hand that can string this bow with the greatest ease, that shoots an arrow clean through all 12 axes, he is the man, Penelope says, I will follow. Now, this is an extremely strong bow, kind of a long bow, you can imagine, and it's extremely difficult to string it. You need immense strength in order to do so, and not just strength. This is the very important point. You need skill in order to do so. And you also need some experience with that bow, because the more you are experienced with the object, the better you are in terms of understanding how that object works. Now, of course, it is Odysseus's bow, and he used to play this game. Perhaps you could imagine them feasting and drinking wine. They'd say, let's set up the arrow, the axe heads. They would do this, and then they would shoot the arrow through the axe heads, and they'd all have fun doing this. And of course, he would do this with his bow, and they would do this. They would use the bow to go out hunting as well. And so he got used to using that bow and to stringing it, right? So the bow then is not like any other bow, which makes it even more difficult to string. It originally belonged to Apollo, and as stated here, it was from Eritus' gallant son, Iphitus. It was a gift to Odysseus, and Eurytus, or Evritis, actually the Greek pronunciation of it, was one of the great renowned archers of the time. He dies, and his son gifts it to Odysseus when he is young, Lacedaemon, which would be the areas of Sparta. So, as this sort of special bow of Apollo, it was likely crafted by the god Hephaestus, who was the great blacksmith of the gods. And so it would have been this very unique bow, sort of having these kind of divine properties, being able to shoot further, faster, having a stronger shot, more accurate shot, and in turn also being extremely sturdy, and you would almost need kind of a divine-like ability to string that bow, which Odysseus kind of has. He's this hero. So here's some interesting things that happen. So as we get into these final events, okay, the game starts, because Penelope has promised we'll do this game after she has been, of course, her wiles have been revealed, that she has been removing all the sewing that she's been doing, the looming, in order to avoid marriage. Finally, she's pressured and she says, fine, to everyone, look, let's do this game, and whoever can string the bow and shoot through the 12 axe heads, I'll marry. Well, it starts, and Telemachus says, hey, before anyone else does it, I want to see if I can string that bow. And he takes the bow and he bends it once. I believe he fails, and he bends it again, and here's the does he fail. He is about to actually string the bow, and his father looks at him and shakes his head, and he says, don't do it. And so this is very interesting because it shows Telemachus is his father's son. So he has that strength, ability, and cunning of his father, so much so that he is able to string that bow, but his father doesn't let him, because had he done so, this would have presented many problems for the rest of the story. The suitors would have been, in fact, resentful toward Telemachus and angered. In fact, all the suitors, one by one, starting with the strongest to the weakest, fail and are unable to bend the bow. In fact, they are so unable to do it that they heat the bow, okay? Because the bow becomes more pliable when you heat it to make it easier to bend, and they still are unable to do it. Finally, the end game begins, and Odysseus, the beggar, finally shouts up with his son's help, and they say, well, let's let the beggar do it. Okay, Odysseus and his son are saying, and the suitors laugh, and they say, this is ridiculous. What a fool! Who could do this? How could you imagine it? And they're also kind of worried. You have to understand that as you read it. They're worried because they've seen that this beggar has immense strength. They threw this stool at him. He didn't move. He crushed basically the bones of this one man, the other beggar, with a single blow. And so they're kind of worried that this beggar is going to string it. So when the scene finally unfolds, where Odysseus does indeed obtain, is finally able to get that bow in his hands, okay, this is where it all really comes to an end for the suitors, because as I'll get into in a moment, Odysseus, their fears really about the beggar come to fruition. So just a few notes about what the bow symbolizes. So the bow is, first of all, this symbol of contrast. It's a contrast between who Odysseus is in comparison to, for example, the suitors and others. Odysseus, his son, his lineage, he is able to string that bow. The suitors are not. It shows also not only that nobility, but the way in which the gods support Odysseus. Why? Because as a gift from the gods, this bow has this divine-like features, and only one who is at least favored by the gods will be able to string it. But those who have lost favor with the gods, the suitors, are unable to string it. And of course, finally, the bow symbolizes death, because it will mean the death of the suitors. And so let's look at that scene where Odysseus finally strings that bow. And so here we have it. Now he held the bow in his own hands, turning it over, tip to tip, testing it. And here we see the suitors mock, laughing at him. What a fool, right? And then, like an expert singer, think of this now, skilled at lyre and song. Okay, so imagine that scene unfolding, an expert singer. So with his virtuoso ease, Odysseus strung his mighty bow. So you can imagine that all 108 men, 109 in fact, if we include his son, struggled with the bow. His son, it took him 2 times. And he still wasn't able to do it because his father told him not to. But 108 men thereafter struggled with that bow. You can imagine it took hours. And this beggar takes it and he puts the string on that bow as if it were like lighting a candle with a match. Okay, so it was that easy. Horror It says, swept through the suitors. You could see it. Something's wrong, they're saying to themselves. Faces blanching white. And at that moment, Zeus cracked the sky with a lightning bolt. His blazing sign. Doom has come, you see. Drawing the bowstring back, he let fly, and never missing an axe from the first axe handle clean on through the last and out. So what has happened here? Okay. The suitors basically realize that the end has come. This is what has happened. And it is hard to them to see it because the ease of the stringing of the bow, the shooting of the bow through the axe handles, it says that something there's almost something supernaturally amiss, and indeed it's not quite supernatural, it's quite natural, it's just that Odysseus has returned. So the recognition occurs. Odysseus strings the bow, shoots an arrow through 12 axes, and then shoots immediately, killing Antinous. And the suitors still disbelieve it. These fools, right? You have to think of this, and you read that. They still think that was a lucky shot, okay? But then he finally reveals himself, saying, "You dogs, you never imagined I'd return from Troy." And the suitors quake in fear, some of them trying, you imagine, to run out immediately. Only Eurymachus, remember, some of these men are warriors. Eurymachus, for all of the indignity of that individual, he is still a steadfast warrior, and he remains steady. And he says, hey, wait a minute, he says to Odysseus. This is Antinous' fault. He goaded us into all of this. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't be here. And he says, let us go, and we will repay all the losses that have been incurred upon your house. Now, of course, this could have been a ruse on the part of Eurymachus. They could have come back with an army afterwards and crushed the house. But for Odysseus, no, it is too late, and no negotiations would be had at that point. Death is the only choice. The indignities that the suitors have cast upon his house have to be repaid. Justice, and this is the key note here, justice, because justice has this universal flavor in ancient society, and indeed is represented by Nike, one of the goddess of justice. It's too late. Okay, it's too late for them, and justice must be restored. So we get these terrible and gruesome deaths that follow, and all of them, for the most part, at least the ones mentioned, die in this way. And in the attack, we have 4 men, Odysseus, his son, and the 2 servants who are aiding him. Athena also aids as mentor, so she takes on another guise. And she doesn't actually aid directly, she only aids by terrifying the suitors at some point. And some, of course, die worse than others. And interestingly, Homer's descriptions are extremely detailed. I would urge anyone who enjoys this work to read Homer's Iliad, which is really this epic tale of war, because the descriptions there of the encounters between different men on the battlefield are truly descriptions that you would imagine of scenes that occurred in the actual life of these ancient men on battlefields. So it's very much worth the reading, and it's also a wonderful epic which has romance and tragedy, and it's full of everything. So in any case, so we see Antinous. He's shot, and listen to this description: square in the throat, and the point went stabbing clean through the soft neck and out. Now this is the important point, and I'm not just pointing these gruesome deaths out just to sort of be morbid in any way. The man's lifeblood came spurting, now look at this, from his nostrils, thick red jets. Well, that's odd, because you could imagine that if someone were to make a film and to depict a scene of a man getting shot in the neck, the blood would come out of the neck. But apparently, and this is of course a question that we could raise, and perhaps I don't think we could test it, obviously. But in ancient times, individuals would have seen this happen, witnessed it, on the battlefield. The blood came spurting out the nose. The descriptions here, they arise from that oral tradition in which individuals have told these tales and the poets have gathered them and put them into a great epic. So the blood doesn't come out of the neck, it comes out of the nostrils. So another one, loosed an arrow, ripping his breast beside the nipple so hard it lodged in the man's, and this is not correct, liver. Wow. So it shot into the chest, the upper chest, and you see the arrow doesn't go out the back as it should, as you would imagine in a scene, right, in a film. No, the arrow instead travels from the breast down through the stomach to the liver and lodges out the liver. Okay, now that's odd, right? Well, this is obviously from these direct encounters that the oral in the tradition. So stabbed by Eumaeus Ctesippus, right in the man's chest, okay, and triumphs over his body. So you see in these ancient encounters that there is this deep satisfaction in these encounters. These men are warriors, right? More carnage. Laothes begs mercy. I hug your knees, Odysseus. Mercy. This is a very important point because in ancient times there is no quarter. In other words, on the battlefield one must face death. And to beg for mercy shows that one lacks courage, right? So, of course, Odysseus refuses and he hacks the prophet square across the neck, cutting his head off. Melanthius. This is very gruesome here. Now what happens is that Melanthius has, of course, abused Odysseus as a beggar. But during the entire encounter, Melanthius helps the suitors by fetching some weapons. Okay, but this really isn't, I think, the basis of why they so deeply mistreat him. Melanthius is tied and hoisted up during the entire scene of the battle, and he hangs in pain. Later, they chop off his ears, nose, they feed his genitals to the dog, and they remove his hands and feet. And they do so with deep ferocity and anger. Why the violence? Why are they so violent to Melanthius? This is a tough question to answer, but I think one way of seeing it is the class differences between Melanthius and Odysseus and the suitors. The suitors, even though they have disrespected Odysseus' house, are still men of the noble class. Melanthius is a man of the servant class. And so the affront on the part, and by comparison, of Melanthius, who is a servant, disrespecting the noble house of the man who he is supposed to serve, you see? This is also a further point, that he is also a servant of the house. He has betrayed Odysseus, okay? And he has betrayed him as a servant, whereas the suitors are simply men from other noble houses. This, I think, would be the reason why he receives such a terrible and gruesome death. The disloyal maids, as well, they receive a terrible death. 12 of them are disloyal, and they are made to clean the blood and the bodies. Okay, it's a bloodbath afterwards, and then they are all hung together on a single rope, in fact. Spared from death. So 2 individuals are not killed. Phemius the bard. You'll see this throughout the epic. They forced the man to sing. What's interesting is if you notice as you read, Homer, he's very sympathetic to bards, to those who sing and tell tales. You could say, well, why? Obviously, because he himself is a bard, okay, a traveling bard, one who sings and tells tales. So perhaps that's the roots of his sympathy. And so Phemius here is spared, and Medon, the herald, this is a funny scene, in fact. He's hiding. I believe it was under a table, and at some point you can imagine Odysseus is saying, is there anyone left? And Telemachus says, well, I think there's the herald. And you could say that Odysseus, the father, angered and also sort of blood, in this blood fury says, well, then let's get him. And Telemachus says, well, I'm not sure, he seems to have been a good man. We should not kill him. And so the herald pricked up his anxious ears, and Telemachus defends him and saves his life. You can see the herald quivering under the table and hearing Telemachus say, well, maybe we shouldn't kill him. So that would have been a very happy moment for him. So then the final scenes that tie up the rest of the work. Odysseus finally confronts Penelope as himself, and she still doesn't run and hug to kiss her husband. Why? Because he's been away for 20 years. And even though he's now transformed back to the man that he is, he's cleaned himself up. He looks like the great Odysseus. He's still 20 years older, and you can imagine that he bears kind of the scars and the struggles of his voyages. So he's an older man, and he's also sort of war-torn looking. But also she's had to deal with these suitors who have told her so many lies over so many years, and so she wants final proof, and he gives her two forms. He says the first is the scar he has, the scar which is very unique, which Euryclea, the other maid, used to identify him, or through which she identified him. And then there's this immovable bed, and she says, well, okay, let's take the bed from upstairs and move it outside, and you can sleep on that, and then we'll see how things work out. And he says, but the bed can't be moved. I built it in such a way that it can't. And then she knows that that's her husband, because only her husband would have known that. So finally they reunite, and there's this happiness between them. Unfortunately, all is not completely well, because as I said, 108 sons of mothers and fathers have now been killed from the surrounding regions in the house of Odysseus. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, maybe it was needed, Homer sort of ties it up a bit quickly. Okay, so we see the final the final scenes. I'll come back to this. The final scene here is that the noble, they come to get revenge, and they oppose but are routed by Odysseus's family, so that Odysseus also opposes them through the help of his own father, okay, who he finally goes to his house to reveal himself to his father. But Athena intercedes, okay, and she breaks it up, and she says everyone has to stop fighting. Zeus has commanded that there should be peace. So in a way it's kind of unfair to the other people of Ithaca, but I think at some point rather, they kind of come around and see, well, you know, the young men, they shouldn't have been doing this, of course. And so this is why Zeus kind of intercedes and says, look, you know, these young men who were in this house got what they deserved. Okay, everything is satisfied. Let it be. Does it resolve things? I'm not sure. Or is it what's called a deus ex machina, a god from the machine? In other words, an unexpected intervention used in a plot to save a hopeless situation. This becomes a question. And just as a note, this notion of a deus ex machina, which is from the Latin, not the Greek, but originates from that, is an expression from machines, this crane used to hoist the tragedians, the actors, onto a stage. So this is the deus ex machina. We can, of course, ask, is that what we have here? And finally, the culminating scenes, which is kind of the pre-culminating, but this is really the culminating scene, is the suitors are led into the underworld by Hermes, and Agamemnon, the great commander there, who of course was murdered by Aegisthus and his wife, wonders, how did all these men die at once? Okay, and one of the suitors, Amphimedon, reports the story about how they died. What is the purpose here? I think you could give it various interpretations. You could think of an interpretation on your own as you read it. One interpretation that I'll give here is, well, maybe it helps to confirm Odysseus's kleos, not only to those living, but also before the gods, and more importantly, before the fallen heroes of Troy with whom he fought. And you'll recall that when Telemachus went to Pylos to speak with King Nestor, that King Nestor mentioned, hey, I heard that things are not really good at your house. You have all these suitors around, right? Well, now we have this scene where it's kind of in a universal way, both in the land of the living and the land of the dead, which Odysseus had kind of visited through a vision, that Odysseus's good name has been restored. And so thus we reach the end of the work. And indeed, as you're reading through this and as you're thinking about this, you'll notice that my own lessons here really didn't focus on so much the scenes themselves, but upon the interpretation of it. And so this is what you want to get out of it, and this will be especially important as we talk about Dante as well, is you're not just reading it just to kind of, like watch a film. It's also to understand there's so many symbols and so many ideas that can be taken from it. And in fact, Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad have served as really subject matter for metaphors and symbols that have built up Western literature from the ground up, along with a number of fundamental works from the other poets and tragedians, etc.